The year was 1886, and the sun over Copper Bend, Arizona, was a hammer. It beat down on the parched earth until the red dust rose in lazy, shimmering clouds, coating everything with a fine grit of rust and regret. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath against the midday heat. Along the single main street, the sign for the Rusty Spur Saloon swung on a single hinge, its squeak a lonesome complaint against the wind. Tumbleweeds, brittle skeletons of last season's growth, rolled in a slow, aimless dance from the edge of the desert, past the livery stable, and toward the small, white-steepled church that stood sentinel beside the town's only well. From the shaded porch of the Finch boarding house, Nora Bell watched one of the tumbleweeds catch on the leg of a bench. She did not pause in her work. Her needle, a tiny glint of silver, moved with a steady, practiced rhythm through the thick canvas of a wagon cover. Stitch, pull, knot. Her hands, though slender, were chapped and calloused from laundry lye and hard labor. But her movements were precise. At 20 years old, Nora had the quiet efficiency of someone twice her age. She kept to herself, a habit that the town's gossips had interpreted as a mix of piety and pride. A good girl, they'd say over the clink of teacups, but as stiff-necked as a mule in a mud bog. Nora heard the whispers. She heard everything, but she kept her eyes down, her thoughts tucked away behind a polite, unreadable expression, the wide brim of her mended straw hat shadowing her face. Each stitch she made was a coin in a jar, another small step toward the only goal that mattered, buying back the small plot of land her mother had loved, the land her uncle had drunk away and lost to a debt held by Silas Crow. A low rumble vibrated through the porch floorboards, a sound of heavy wheels and disciplined hoofbeats. Nora looked up, her hands stilling for a moment. One of the Cade freight wagons was rolling down the street, pulled by a team of 8 matched mules that moved with the smooth power of a river current. The wagon was loaded high with barrels and crates, all of it lashed down under a web of ropes tied so tightly they hummed in the dry air like the strings of a giant bass fiddle. The man driving the team was Wyatt Cade himself. He sat tall on the wagon seat, his back straight, his hands light but firm on the reins. Unlike the other ranchers who favored ornate saddles and silver conchos, Wyatt was dressed in plain, durable clothes that were impeccably clean. His face was lean, browned by the sun, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who calculated risk and profit in the same breath, who weighed every word before he spoke it. He owned the sprawling Cade ranch that bordered the territory and the freight line that was its lifeblood. Yet he often drove the lead wagon himself. It was said he trusted his own hands more than anyone else's. As the wagon drew level with the boarding house, his gaze swept over the porch. For a single, suspended heartbeat, his eyes met Nora's. There was no warmth in the look, no flirtation, just a cool, level assessment. He saw a young woman mending canvas with an expert's hand. She saw a man whose discipline was a wall around a tightly guarded core. It was the polite, distant acknowledgement of 2 people who occupied the same small town but lived in different worlds. Then the moment passed. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, and she lowered her head back to her work. The wagon rumbled on, leaving behind only a fresh cloud of red dust. Inside the boarding house, stirring a pot of stew that already seemed too heavy for the weather, Eloise Finch clicked her tongue. She was a woman built for comfort, soft and round, but her mind was as sharp as Nora's needle. "That man," she said, speaking to the fragrant steam rising from the pot. "He builds his life like he builds his fences, straight lines, strong posts, and no room for anything wild to slip through. Thinks he can rope and tie the whole world into neat parcels." Nora said nothing, but a small smile touched her lips. She knew what Mrs. Finch meant. Wyatt Cade was a force in Copper Bend, a pillar of stability against the shifting sands of the frontier. He paid his men well and on time, and his word was as good as gold, but he was also a man who had buried a young wife years ago and, by all accounts, had buried his heart right along with her. He was respected, even admired, but he kept the world at arm's length with a chilling courtesy. He was the opposite of the other power in town. Silas Crow. As if the thought had summoned him. Crow himself emerged from the land office across the street. He was a man who dressed in black broadcloth, even in the punishing heat, as if to set himself apart from the dusty, sweat-stained folk he preyed upon. He was not a physically imposing man, but he carried an aura of predatory stillness. His face was pale and smooth. His smile, a thin, bloodless line. His eyes, small and dark, seemed to absorb the light around them. He paused on the boardwalk, his gaze landing on Nora with a proprietary air that made her skin crawl. He held the mortgages on half the farms in the county, and he held the piece of paper that represented her uncle's final, foolish debt, a debt he had made it clear he would forgive, for a price. That price was Nora herself. He had spoken of marriage, of making her the mistress of his large, empty house, but his tone had made the offer sound more like a foreclosure than a proposal. As he watched her, his right hand went to his left, and he began to slowly, methodically, twist the heavy silver ring on his little finger. It was his signature gesture, the movement he made when he was contemplating a new acquisition. Nora felt his stare like a physical touch, cold and unwelcome. She forced herself to keep sewing, to make her stitches even and strong. To falter would be to show weakness, and she could not afford that. The whole town of Copper Bend was a stage, and every resident played their part under a harsh, unforgiving light. Prejudice was as common as alkali dust. A woman alone was a woman vulnerable, and a woman in debt was a prize to be claimed. The law was whatever the sheriff, Hank Doyle, said it was, and everyone knew Sheriff Doyle took his orders from the man in the black broadcloth coat. The town's morality was preached on Sundays from the pulpit of the little church by Father Whitman, a good man with a gentle heart, but during the week, the real sermons were delivered in the form of interest rates and eviction notices by Silas Crow. There was a fragile peace, a dry, tender hope, but it was Silas's law that held the tightest grip. Nora pulled her thread taut, the knot sinking firmly into the canvas. She had patched the wind rip. Her work was about survival, about mending what was torn, whether it was a wagon cover or the fabric of her own life. She reached into her sewing basket, and her fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of blue ribbon. It was faded from years of being held, the last thing her mother had given her. It was a tangible piece of a gentler memory, a promise she had made to herself. That ribbon was the color of hope, a stark contrast to the endless, oppressive red of the dust that settled on everything in Copper Bend, a dust that felt like the town's judgment, clinging to her clothes, her skin, her very future. Later that afternoon, Wyatt Cade stood by the town well, letting his mules drink their fill from the trough. The well was the heart of the town, the one place everyone had to come, and the truth, much like the water, was often muddied. He overheard two women talking as they worked the pump handle, saw him looking at Nora Bell again. One said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, "Silas Crow. He circles that girl like a hawk circles a field mouse. Eloise Finch keeps a close watch." The other replied, "But a hawk is a patient thing, and that girl has her mother's pride. It'll be the death of her." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He did not involve himself in town gossip. It was inefficient, a waste of energy. His focus was singular, establishing a new, faster freight route through Blacktooth Pass. It was dangerous, the terrain unforgiving, but the payoff would be immense. It would solidify his business and provide steady work for his men like Miguel Ortega, his best driver and his closest friend, who was currently checking the harnesses on the team. But to open that route, he needed everything to be perfect. He could not afford distractions or complications. And Silas Crow was a complication he had been watching for a very long time. He pulled a pair of worn leather work gloves from his belt. The leather was supple and shaped to his hands, a second skin. He pulled them on. The simple act, a familiar ritual. The gloves meant work. They meant control. They were a promise of safety to his men, a symbol of his responsibility. He had built his entire world on that foundation. Control your work, protect your people, and do not let emotion cloud your judgment. Yet, the image of the young woman on the porch, her face shadowed by that ridiculous straw hat, her hands moving with such determined grace, lingered in his mind. He'd seen the way she handled the heavy canvas, the strength in her slender frame. There was a resilience in her, a quiet defiance that was as plain as the straightness of her spine. She was like a desert flower, seemingly fragile but with roots that ran deep into the rocky soil, determined to survive. It was a quality he recognized and respected, and it was a quality that would put her directly in Silas Crow's path. He dismissed the thought. It was not his concern. He had a freight line to run. He clapped Miguel on the shoulder. "Let's get this cargo to the depot. The mountains are waiting," as they led the mules away from the well. Nora came out of the boarding house, a heavy wooden bucket in each hand. She walked toward the well, her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her. She did not look at him. Wyatt did not look back at her. Their paths crossed without touching, two solitary figures moving through the red dust, each carrying their own burdens under the relentless, watchful eye of the Arizona sun. A fragile seed of hope lay dormant in the dry earth between them, waiting for a storm to break it open. The quiet of the Arizona night was a thin veneer, easily torn. Near the skeletal cottonwoods of Drybone Creek, the moonlight painted the landscape in stark shades of silver and black. The only sounds were the creak of harness leather, the soft thud of mule hoofs in the dust, and Miguel Ortega's low, off-key humming. He and Wyatt were on the last leg of a long haul, bringing supplies back from the market town, and the familiar rhythm of the journey had lulled them into a state of weary contentment. Then the night exploded. A volley of rifle shots shattered the peace, the sound unnaturally loud and flat in the open air. The lead mules screamed and reared, their eyes wild with terror. The heavy freight wagon lurched violently, its wheels skittering sideways. Wyatt, his reflexes honed by years of managing chaos, was instantly on his feet, his hands a blur as he fought the reins, his voice a low, commanding roar that cut through the panic of the animals. "Hold them! Miguel, hold them!" Another volley erupted, this time from the opposite side of the creek bed. A bullet whined past Wyatt's ear, close enough to feel the heat of its passage. Miguel cried out, a sharp curse followed by a grunt of pain, and clutched his arm. The wagon slammed to a halt, the mules tangled in their traces, trembling and snorting plumes of dusty air. The silence that followed was more menacing than the noise had been. Wyatt scanned the deep shadows of the creek bank, his own rifle now in his hands, his body coiled and ready. "Miguel, are you hit bad?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Just a graze. Jefe, stings like a hornet." But the bullet kept going. Miguel's teeth were clenched, but his other hand was already reaching for his own pistol. They waited. The wind whispered through the dry grass. Nothing moved. There was no demand for money, no rush to seize the cargo. After a long, tense minute, the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the distance. It was over as quickly as it had begun. Wyatt kept his rifle trained on the darkness for another full minute before he moved. He lit a lantern, the small flame pushing back the immense darkness in a weak, flickering circle. Miguel's sleeve was torn and bloody, but, as he'd said, the wound was a shallow furrow along his forearm. What Wyatt found next confirmed his suspicions. Lying in the dust near the wagon was a small burlap sack. Its contents spilled onto the ground. It was not gold or silver, but a fine, black powder. Charcoal. "Crow," Wyatt said, the name a hard, cold pebble in his mouth. He nudged the bag with his boot. It was a message, not a robbery. An unsubtle suggestion that those who wanted to operate safely in this territory paid a certain insurance fee to Silas Crow. The blank cartridges he'd suspected from the flat sound of the shots were another part of the intimidation. They were meant to frighten, not to kill. This time, the real damage was to the wagon. The attackers had known what to do. The main reins were sliced nearly through, and a quick inspection of the wheels revealed that several linchpins had been expertly worked loose. The wagon was crippled, a beached whale in a sea of sand. "We cannot move it like this," Miguel said, wincing as he tied a kerchief around his arm. "Not safely. The whole thing could come apart on the next incline." Wyatt's mind worked with cold precision. They were miles from the ranch. Walking back was an option, but leaving a wagon full of valuable goods unattended was an invitation for real thieves. He had to get to town, find the blacksmith. But it was well past midnight. The entire town of Copper Bend would be dark, every door bolted, every door but one. He remembered the faint light he always saw burning late in the window of the Finch boarding house. It took them over an hour to unhitch the mules and ride them back to town, leaving 2 trusted hands to stand guard over the wagon. As he'd expected, Copper Bend was a ghost town, silent and shuttered. Only a single, soft yellow lamp glowed in a downstairs window of the boarding house. He swung down from his mule and walked onto the porch, his boots making a hollow sound on the wooden planks. He knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a moment, the door opened a crack. Nora Bell stood there, holding the lamp. She was not dressed for bed. She wore a simple work dress, and her hands were smudged with wood polish. Her eyes, wide in the lamplight, showed surprise but no fear. "Mr. Cade," she said, her voice low and steady. "It is late." "I know. I apologize for the hour. Miss Bell, I need a wheelwright." "A carpenter. My wagon's been disabled out at Drybone Creek." "The blacksmith's house is at the end of the street. I imagine he is fast asleep." She made no move to open the door wider. "I imagine he is," Wyatt agreed, his patience wearing thin. "But Mrs. Finch once mentioned you have a talent for mending things. Not just canvas, but wood." Her expression did not change, but a flicker of something, perhaps pride or caution, moved in her eyes. "My father taught me a few things. It is not a trade I practice for hire. I will pay you double the blacksmith's rate. I need the work done tonight. I have cargo that cannot wait." She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. For a long moment, she seemed to be weighing not just his offer, but the man himself, the power he held, the subtle debt that accepting such a favor would create. "I do not work on credit, Mr. Cade," she said finally, her tone as crisp as a new banknote. "And I do not accept favors that feel like they might be called in later. I will require payment in cash, before the work begins." Wyatt was taken aback. He was accustomed to people eagerly accepting his terms, grateful for the work. This young woman was negotiating with him as an equal, her self-respect a shield she held firmly in front of her. He found he did not mind. He respected it. "Fair enough," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a roll of bills. He counted out a sum that made her eyes widen slightly, though she masked it quickly. He held the money out to her. She did not take it immediately. She looked from the money to his face, and then she gave a single, sharp nod. She disappeared back into the house and returned a moment later with a heavy tool roll and her straw hat. The work at the creek was done in the shifting, spectral light of 2 lanterns. Nora moved with a quiet competence that impressed him. She examined the sliced reins. Judging the damage with a critical eye, she tested the wheels, her hands running over the loose hubs and pins. She was not strong in the way a man was strong, but her movements were efficient and clever. She used leverage and technique, her knowledge of wood and stress points evident in every action. She showed Miguel how to brace the wheel so she could hammer the pins back into place, securing them with fresh wire. She did not speak much, answering Wyatt's questions with short, precise sentences. As she worked, Wyatt found himself watching her hands. They were not the soft, delicate hands of a town lady. They were capable, scarred in places, the hands of someone who understood the mechanics of the world. He had offered her money, but what he was truly seeing was a strength that could not be bought. By the time the sky began to gray in the east, the wagon was secure. The reins were spliced and wrapped, a temporary but strong repair. The wheels were solid. "It will hold until you get to the ranch," she said, wiping grease from her hands onto a rag. "But you will want a blacksmith to forge new pins." "I am in your debt, Miss Bell," Wyatt said, the words feeling inadequate. "You paid the bill, Mr. Cade," she replied, her voice cool. "There is no debt." She refused his offer of a ride back, preferring to walk the miles to town alone as the sun rose, a solitary figure moving through the vast, empty landscape. The next morning, as Nora was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house, a shadow fell over her. She turned to find Silas Crow standing there. He was dressed in his funereal black, a stark figure against the bright morning. He smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. "Good morning, Nora," he said, his voice as smooth as oiled leather. "I trust you slept well." She did not answer, simply stood with a wet sheet in her hands, waiting. "I have come with a proposition," he continued, undeterred by her silence. He held up a hand, and on his palm lay a small, velvet-covered box. In his other hand, he held a folded legal document. "I find myself in need of a wife, a woman to manage my household. And you, my dear, find yourself in a precarious position, thanks to your late uncle's poor judgment." He opened the box to reveal a small gold ring with a single, tiny pearl. "This for your finger." Then he waved the document. "And this, the deed forgiving your family's debt in its entirety. The land will be yours again. All you must do is agree to be my wife." Nora looked from the ring to the paper, and then to his pale, expectant face. The air crackled with the unspoken reality of the transaction. He was not offering love, or even partnership. He was offering a financial exchange, her freedom for a piece of paper. "You are not offering marriage, Mr. Crow," she said, her voice low but clear as a bell. "You are offering a bill of sale, and I am not for sale." The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, flat anger. "Pride is a luxury for those who can afford it. Nora, you cannot. Perhaps this will clarify your situation." He snapped his fingers. Sheriff Hank Doyle, who had been waiting by the corner of the house, stepped forward. He was a large, sloppy man whose authority came entirely from the star pinned to his vest. "Miss Bell," Doyle said, avoiding her eyes, "Mr. Crow has brought to my attention a discrepancy in the original survey of your mother's plot of land. The title seems to be invalid. We will have to open a legal inquiry." Nora felt a chill go through her despite the heat. It was a lie, a fabrication, but a powerful one. A legal inquiry meant fees, lawyers, and a battle she could not possibly win against a man who owned the sheriff and likely the judge as well. He was going to take the land from her, one way or another. Silas smiled again, a triumphant, ugly thing. "The offer stands. Reconsider, my dear. I am a patient man." He turned and walked away, Doyle trailing in his wake like a well-fed dog. Nora stood frozen, the wet sheet growing heavy in her hands. He had cornered her. The anger was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth, but beneath it was a cold knot of fear. She needed help. Not a protector, but a weapon. She needed a way to fight back. An idea, born of desperation and the events of the previous night, began to take shape in her mind. Cade Freight had been targeted. Silas was trying to squeeze Wyatt Cade, just as he was squeezing her. Their enemy was the same, and Wyatt Cade needed people he could trust, people who were not afraid of hard work. The wages would be good, better than anything she could make at the boarding house. Enough, perhaps, to hire the one person in town who might be able to fight Crow on his own terms, Dr. Amelia Pike, who, in addition to being a physician, had a formidable and largely unused knowledge of the law. She made her decision. She finished hanging the laundry, her movements once again crisp and deliberate. She went inside, washed her face and hands, and walked directly to the Cade Freight office at the edge of town. Wyatt was there, going over a ledger with Miguel. He looked up in surprise as she entered. I will take the job, she said without preamble. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. Job I do not recall offering you one. You need workers for your new route through Blacktooth Pass, she stated. Not as a question, but as a fact. You need people who are reliable, who can handle repairs, and who are not on Silas Crow's payroll. I am all of those things. I will work for you. For the same pay you gave me last night. He studied her, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw the anger there, the defiance, but also the sharp, calculating intelligence. He saw that she was not running from a problem. She was running toward a solution. He thought of the way she had handled the tools, her calm under pressure. He had a freight line to build, and he needed soldiers. Not just employees. He nodded slowly. You start tomorrow? Be here at dawn. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. If you need a place of refuge, Miss Bell, the north porch at the Cade Ranch is always available for airing laundry. It was the closest he could come to offering protection, a guarded, indirect gesture of sanctuary. Nora paused at the door and looked back at him over her shoulder. A small, wry smile touched her lips. The first he had ever seen. I am coming to work, Mr. Cade, she said, not to air my laundry. And with that, she walked out into the dusty street, her back straight, her future uncertain, but for the first time, feeling the solid weight of a weapon in her own hands. The Cade Ranch at dawn was a world away from the sleepy, dust-choked streets of Copper Bend. It was a place of purpose, a symphony of controlled energy that began long before the sun crested the eastern mesas. The air smelled of strong coffee, hot metal from the blacksmith's forge, and the clean, earthy scent of hay. Men moved with a quiet economy of motion, their voices low as they called to each other. The sounds of their work, the ring of a hammer, the jingle of harness, a steady percussion beneath the vast, silent sky. For Nora, it was like learning a new language. Wyatt Cade was a demanding teacher, but a thorough one. He did not believe in theory. He believed in the education of the hands. He stood beside her in the raking morning light, a length of thick rope in his hands, and taught her the intricate art of the diamond hitch, the knot that was the heart of any secure freight load. His instructions were sparse, his words chosen as carefully as a mule chooses its footing on a steep trail. The rope must think it is part of the cargo, he said, his fingers guiding hers, showing her how the tension must be distributed, how one loop secured the next in a chain of unshakable logic. His hands were calloused and hard, but his touch was surprisingly light, a brief, impersonal contact that nonetheless sent a strange current through her. She, in turn, showed him things his world of masculine logic had never considered. When a sudden fierce wind kicked up from the plains, threatening to tear a newly erected canvas shelter from its moorings, the men fought against it with brute force. Nora watched for a moment, then walked to the upwind side, untied 2 specific ropes, and re-angled the main support pole. The canvas shuddered, then billowed, catching the wind and redirecting it, the entire structure suddenly settling into a stable, quiet harmony with the gale. Wyatt watched, an eyebrow raised in question. It is a laundrywoman's trick, she explained, her voice nearly lost in the wind. You do not fight the wind head-on, you give it a path. It is about knowing which way the wind wants to break, not just forcing it to stop. He looked from the secure canvas to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond professional respect in his eyes. A cautious familiarity began to grow between them, expressed not in pleasantries, but in a dry, laconic humor. One afternoon, while securing a load, she found herself a few inches short on a critical tie-down rope. A man this wealthy, she said, more to Miguel than to Wyatt. Though she knew he could hear, you would think he could spare another foot of rope. Wyatt, without turning from the harness he was inspecting, answered in a low, even tone. I save on rope so I can afford to pay stubborn carpenters their exorbitant fees. Miguel choked back a laugh, and Nora felt a surprising warmth spread through her chest. It was the first time he had acknowledged their first meeting with anything other than cool formality. The shared joke was a fragile thread, but a thread nonetheless. Her carefully constructed world of work and self-preservation was irrevocably altered by the arrival of a small, silent girl with eyes the color of a fawn's. Her name was Ruby, an 8-year-old orphan from a failed homestead, whose parents had been taken by fever. The circuit preacher had left her at the boarding house, and Nora, seeing the same lost, determined pride in the child that she nurtured in herself, had quietly taken her under her wing. She brought Ruby with her to the ranch, unable to leave her to the mercies of the town. Ruby rarely spoke, but she watched everything, her small hands often busy carving a piece of soft wood with a dull knife Nora had given her. She was a ghost at the edge of their busy world, and her deepest, unspoken wish was for a simple calico dress, so she could look like the other girls when the schoolhouse finally opened. One evening, as Nora was showing Ruby how to carve a bird, Wyatt approached. He was awkward around the child, his usual confidence replaced by a stiff uncertainty. He stood for a long moment, then cleared his throat. "For your studies," he said, and handed Ruby not a doll or a sweet, but a clean, new notebook and a sharpened pencil. Ruby stared at the gift as if it were a block of solid gold. Her small fingers traced the cover. Then she looked up at Wyatt, a rare, brilliant smile transforming her face. Later, Miguel sat with her, and with his large, gentle hands, he took a page from the notebook and folded it into the shape of a boat, showing her how to make it sail across a bucket of water. In that moment, surrounded by the rough, quiet kindness of these men, Nora felt a dangerous crack appear in the wall around her heart. The town, of course, noticed everything. The whispers started in the general store and bloomed in the church pews. Nora Bell, the stiff-necked girl, had gone to work for Wyatt Cade. The conclusion was immediate and damning. She is trading her reputation for that piece of land. One woman sniffed over a bag of flour. Cade will get what he wants, and she will get her deed. A simple transaction. When Nora went back to the boarding house to collect her and Ruby's things, Eloise Finch met her at the door with a plate of freshly baked biscuits. "Gossip cakes," Eloise announced, her expression grim. "I baked them this morning. They are salty enough to make you thirsty for the truth and spiced with enough black pepper to sting the lying tongues." She patted Nora's hand. "You pay them no mind. You hear a woman's work is her own business, her reasons, too." The work itself was a harsh and relentless teacher. As they pushed the first exploratory wagon train toward the foothills of Blacktooth Pass, the landscape turned hostile. The first sign of the dust storm was not a sound, but a silence. The insects stopped chirping, the birds vanished, and a strange, sickly yellow light fell over the land. On the horizon, a solid wall of churning red dust rose thousands of feet into the air, a monstrous, unstoppable wave of earth. The mules became skittish, their ears twitching, their eyes rolling. Wyatt shouted orders up, his voice tight with urgency, telling the men to form a tight circle with the wagons and prepare to ride it out. But Nora was staring at the line of low hills to their left. She remembered her mother telling her stories of these storms, of how the old ones survived them. "There is a better way," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the rising panic. Wyatt turned to her, his face a mask of grim concentration. "The storm will break over us here. But there," she pointed, "there is a dry arroyo, a gully. My mother used to say they were the scars of old rivers. They run deep, deep enough to give us shelter." He hesitated for only a second, his calculating eyes measuring the distance, the angle of the approaching storm, and the certainty in her face. He saw no fear in her, only a clear, focused knowledge. "Lead the way, Miss Bell," he said, his voice a low command to the other men. She did. She urged her mule forward, her memory of her mother's words a map in her mind. They reached the lip of the arroyo just as the first tendrils of wind hit them, a physical blow that stole their breath. They scrambled down the steep bank, men and mules sliding in a controlled chaos, and huddled at the bottom as the world above them disappeared into a roaring, suffocating cloud of red. The noise was a physical thing, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through the ground. For what felt like an eternity, they could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Nora pressed Ruby's face into her side, shielding her from the worst of it. When it was over, and a weak, filtered light returned, they emerged into a world transformed, every surface coated in a thick blanket of red dust. Wyatt looked at Nora, his face streaked with dirt, and the look he gave her was one of profound reassessment. He had seen her not as a woman to be protected, but as a partner in survival. Later that week, Wyatt used his influence in a way that Nora had only ever seen Silas Crow use his to exert power. But the difference was stark. He learned that a family named Jensen, good people with a string of bad luck, were about to be foreclosed on by the bank in the next county. Wyatt rode out, not with threats, but with a bank draft and a quiet, unshakable authority. He paid off their debt, restructuring it into a long-term, interest-free loan to be worked off at the ranch. He saved them, but when he returned, he was all business, his discipline as sharp and unyielding as ever. He was a good man, Nora realized, but his goodness was forged in iron, not in sentiment. That night, cleaning his rifle by the fire, Wyatt took the misshapen bullet he had recovered from the ambush at Drybone Creek and examined it again. In the flickering light, he saw something he had missed before: a tiny, almost invisible scratch near the base, a double line etched into the lead. It was a maker's mark, as unique as a signature. He had seen it before. It was the mark of Mason, a reclusive gunsmith who had served in the war and now did custom work for anyone who could pay his high prices, no questions asked. And Wyatt knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his gut, that Mason's most frequent customer was Silas Crow. For Nora, the growing sense of safety at the ranch was a quiet, insidious threat. She felt it when Wyatt passed her a cup of coffee without a word, a simple gesture of inclusion. She felt it when Miguel told Ruby a funny story that made the little girl's shoulders shake with silent laughter. These moments of peace were terrifying. All her life, she had equated attachment with ownership. Her uncle's ruinous affection, Silas Crow's predatory offers, they were all forms of possession. She was afraid of letting her guard down, of allowing this fragile sense of belonging to become a chain. As she lay on her cot that night, listening to the soft breathing of the sleeping child beside her, she forced herself to remember why she was here. It was a job, a means to an end. The money she earned was for Ruby, for Dr. Amelia Pike's legal fees, for the hope of buying back her mother's land. She could not afford to confuse a safe harbor with a home. The reins that held her and Wyatt together were a temporary, mended thing. They were holding a straight line for now, but the leather was still strained, and the tension was immense. The ascent into the high country of Blacktooth Pass was a journey into a different season. Down on the plains, autumn was a dry, golden affair. But here, the air was thin and sharp, with the bite of coming winter. A late-season storm, a rarity the old-timers spoke of with grim respect, had swept through the peaks 2 nights before, leaving behind a treacherous blanket of white. The narrow track that served as a road was now a ribbon of slick, packed snow and hidden ice, winding its way along the edges of breathtaking drops. Their cargo was precious crates of medicine, quinine, and bandages for the isolated Sunstone mining camp, where a fever was running rampant. The weight of this responsibility settled on the small caravan more heavily than the cold. Every creak of the wagon, every nervous snort from the mules, was amplified in the profound silence of the snow-covered mountains. Nora, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, rode her mule near the lead wagon, her eyes constantly scanning the road ahead, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Wyatt drove the lead wagon himself, his face set in lines of intense concentration. His trust in his men was absolute, but on a road like this, with a cargo like this, he put his faith only in his own hands. The iron tires of the heavy wagon crunched on the snow, the sound a lonely rhythm in the vast, white wilderness. Miguel rode alongside, his usual stream of cheerful chatter silenced by the unforgiving terrain. They were navigating a particularly narrow stretch, with a sheer rock face on one side and a dizzying 1,000-foot drop on the other. When the world tilted on its axis, it began with a sound not loud, but sharp and final, like a bone snapping. It was the sound of tortured metal giving up. A shearing pin on the front axle, weakened by the relentless cold and the strain of the heavy load, had failed. The wagon gave a violent, sickening lurch. The front left wheel canted inward, and the entire massive vehicle began to slide, gravity taking hold with a terrible, inexorable pull. It was no longer a wagon. It was a runaway, a multi-ton avalanche of wood and iron, dragged by a team of panicked, screaming mules. Wyatt was a blur of motion, his body a coiled spring of desperate strength. He threw his entire weight against the reins, his boots braced against the footboard, his voice a raw roar of command, trying to turn the terrified team into the rock face, away from the abyss. But the angle was too sharp, the momentum too great. The wagon was sliding sideways, its heavy rear end swinging out over the precipice. Chaos erupted. The men shouted, their words snatched away by the wind. The mules brayed in terror, their hooves scrabbling for purchase on the icy track. Time seemed to warp, stretching into a long, terrifying scream. But in that chaotic moment, Nora's mind went unnaturally calm. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her thoughts were crystal clear. She saw the problem not with the eyes of a teamster, but with the eyes of a mender. She saw the mechanics of the disaster, the failed pin, the sliding wheel, the unstoppable momentum, and she saw the solution. Before anyone could react, before Wyatt could even form a coherent order, she had slid from her mule. She grabbed a heavy oak wedge, a chalk block used for securing the wagon on steep grades, and a spare length of rein from her saddle. She did not hesitate. She ran toward the sliding behemoth, toward the churning hooves and the groaning, splintering wood. Nora, get back! Wyatt's voice was a frantic bellow, a sound of pure terror. He saw her small figure, a flash of brown wool against the snow, and his heart seized. She ignored him. She had one chance. She dove low, sliding on the icy ground, under the massive wooden tongue of the wagon that connected the team to the chassis. The air was filled with the hot, rank smell of panicked animals. A flailing hoof missed her head by inches. She could feel the vibration of the sliding wagon through the frozen ground. A deep, earth-shaking groan. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she shoved the oak wedge hard against the front of the sliding wheel, aiming for the narrow space between the iron tire and the icy road. The wagon's immense weight caught the wedge, which bit, splintered, and held for a fraction of a second, creating a drag point. A moment of friction in the midst of the frictionless slide. It was not enough to stop it, but it was enough to slow it, to alter its deadly trajectory by a few precious degrees. As she jammed the wedge into place, the rough ground tore at her leg, ripping through her trousers and the skin of her knee. Her hand, guiding the block, was scraped raw against the frozen earth. Wyatt, even as he yelled for her to retreat, was reacting. He saw what she was doing, and his entire body became an extension of his will to save her. He hauled on the reins with a final, desperate surge of strength. Not just to control the team, but to keep the wagon from crushing her, to use the mules as a living shield. At the same time, Miguel, recovering from his initial shock, acted with the quick thinking of a seasoned freighter. He launched himself from his saddle, a coil of rope already in his hands. He scrambled up the rock face, finding a precarious foothold, and with a powerful heave, he flung the rope, anchoring it around a jutting spur of granite. It was a makeshift anchor, a desperate, long-shot gamble. The combined effect was instantaneous and violent. The drag from Nora's wedge, the pull from Wyatt's mules, and the sudden, jarring tension from Miguel's anchor rope all hit at once. The freight wagon shuddered, groaned as if its wooden soul were breaking, and then slammed to a halt. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. The rear wheels of the wagon hung out over the abyss, spinning slowly, uselessly, in the empty air. Below them, there was nothing but 1,000 feet of wind and snow. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The only sound was the frantic, shuddering gasps of the mules and the soft, steady whisper of the wind over the pass. Nora lay on the ground, half tucked under the wagon's tongue, shaking uncontrollably from cold and shock. But her eyes, when she looked up, were wide and blazing with a fierce, triumphant light. Wyatt stared at her, his knuckles white on the reins, his chest heaving. The terror he had felt moments before was slowly receding, replaced by a wave of raw, unadulterated awe. He was looking at her not as his employee, not as the quiet girl from the boarding house, but as a soldier, a comrade who had faced death alongside him and had not flinched. Slowly, shakily, Nora pushed herself up. Blood trickled from a gash on her hand and soaked the torn fabric over her knee. She looked at Wyatt, and a strange, breathless wisp of a smile touched her lips. "Boss," she rasped, each word punctuated by a gasp for air. "You are missing a pin." The absurdity of it, the sheer, magnificent understatement, broke the tension. A ragged, hoarse sound escaped Wyatt's throat. It was not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. "Marry me," he gasped back, the words torn from him, utterly unplanned. "I will give you a whole jar of them." From his perch on the rock, Miguel let out a wild, whooping laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. The other men, their faces pale with shock, joined in, their laughter rough and cracked in the thin, cold air. The aftermath was a slow, painful process of securing the wagon, calming the mules, and assessing the damage. They made camp right there on the treacherous road, unwilling to risk moving another inch until full daylight. As the cold of the evening settled in, a deep chill took hold of Nora. Her teeth began to chatter, and a feverish flush bloomed on her cheeks. Ruby, her small face etched with worry, silently appeared at her side and tucked a thick wool blanket around her shivering shoulders. Miguel, ever practical, soon had a fire blazing and a pot of cocoa, thick with condensed milk and sugar, bubbling over the flames. Wyatt knelt beside Nora, his face grim in the firelight. He had a clean strip of linen and a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic. "Give me your hand," he said, his voice low and rough. She held it out, and he gently took it in his own. He cleaned the raw, bloody scrape with a tenderness that seemed entirely at odds with his hard exterior. And as he worked, wrapping the clean linen around her palm, she saw that his hands, the hands that could control 8 panicked mules with unshakable strength, were trembling. He did not meet her eyes. He focused on the bandage, his movements slow and deliberate. In the shared, fire-lit silence, something profound shifted between them. It was not the flowery, poetic nonsense of dime novels. It was a trust forged in the crucible of survival, an affection born not of courtship, but of the shared, terrifying knowledge of how close they had come to the edge. Later, when the others were settled, Wyatt took a lantern and walked back to the scene of the accident. His mind was replaying the sharp snap of the breaking pin. It felt wrong. He had inspected that wagon himself before they left. He knelt in the snow, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. He examined the track, the gouge marks from the sliding wheel, and then he saw them. Partially obscured by their own frantic tracks were the prints of a single horse. They were neat, clear impressions in the snow. And they were unique. The horseshoes were custom forged, with a distinctive crescent shape on the heel, a flourish favored by a certain blacksmith who worked exclusively for one man in Copper Bend. Wyatt had seen those prints before, in the dust outside the land office, in the dirt of the main street. They belonged to Silas Crow's black stallion. He had not been there by accident. This was not a mechanical failure. It was an attempt at murder. The return to Copper Bend was a descent from the clean, sharp honesty of the mountains into a thick, cloying atmosphere of whispers. News of the runaway wagon, and Nora's role in stopping it, had trickled down before them, twisted and reshaped by the town's insatiable appetite for gossip. They were no longer just the freight boss and his new hire. They were a story, a puzzle to be solved. And in a town like Copper Bend, any unsolved puzzle was quickly filled in with the ugliest assumptions. Silas Crow did not wait long to make his move. He understood that power was not just held, but performed. His counterattack was a masterpiece of sanctimonious theater. He organized a special community charity social to be held after Sunday services. The stated purpose, printed on flyers that appeared overnight in the general store and the saloon, was to raise funds for the town's proposed schoolhouse. The true purpose became clear the moment Father Whitman, a man whose gentle nature was easily manipulated, cleared his throat to address the assembled congregation. He spoke of Christian duty, of lifting up those who had fallen into hardship, and then, with a benevolent nod, he ceded the floor to the town's greatest benefactor, Mr. Silas Crow. Silas stepped forward, his black suit absorbing the light in the stuffy church. He held a Bible in one hand, though it looked less like an object of faith and more like a prop. His voice was sonorous, dripping with false piety. He spoke of the fragility of a woman's position in the world, the dangers of debt, and the sacred duty of a strong man to offer shelter and protection. And then, his eyes scanned the crowd and found Nora, who stood near the back with Eloise Finch. "We have among us," Silas declared, his voice ringing with theatrical compassion, "a young woman of good character who, through no fault of her own, has been left in a most precarious state. A young woman who, in her desperation, has been forced to take on dangerous, unfeminine work. I speak, of course, of our dear Nora Bell." A murmur went through the crowd. Nora felt 100 pairs of eyes turn to her, a wave of mingled pity, curiosity, and judgment. She stood perfectly still, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. "Therefore," Silas continued, raising his voice to a crescendo, "as an act of faith and charity, I wish to publicly renew my offer. I will personally forgive her family's debt, restore her mother's land to her name, and take her under my protection as my wife. I will rescue her from a life of toil and uncertainty. I will, before God and this community, save her." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. He had framed it perfectly. To refuse was not just to refuse him, but to refuse the town's charity, to reject the church's concern, to spit in the face of salvation itself. He was offering her a golden cage, and he had made the entire town the locksmith's. Nora took a single step forward, out of the shadow of the back wall. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried with a shocking clarity in the hushed church. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Crow, and thank you, neighbors." She looked around, her gaze meeting the eyes of the women she did laundry for, the men she served meals to. But charity should be a gift, given freely. It should not come with conditions. She turned her clear, steady gaze back to Silas. "Charity is not a golden chain." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a direct, public rebuke, a slap in the face to the most powerful man in town. Silas Crow's pious mask slipped, for a fleeting instant. A look of pure, cold fury flashed in his eyes, before being replaced by a sorrowful, wounded expression. Father Whitman looked flustered, wringing his hands. Eloise Finch, standing beside Nora, looked as proud as if she had just seen the sun rise in the west. The social ended in a flurry of awkward, whispered conversations. The door of the church, which had been meant to frame Nora's salvation, now felt like the door of a prison she had just refused to enter. But as she and Eloise walked back to the boarding house, Nora saw that the kitchen door was propped wide open, and the smell of baking bread and warm cinnamon spilled out into the dusty street. The formal community had closed its ranks, But the real one, the one of warmth and sustenance, was waiting for her. Silas's retaliation was swift and ugly. The next afternoon, as Nora was helping Ruby practice her letters at the kitchen table, a heavy knock rattled the front door. It was Sheriff Hank Doyle, his bulk filling the doorway, his face flushed with the discomfort of a man doing another's dirty work. "Nora Bell," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I have a warrant to search these premises." A warrant for what Eloise demanded, stepping in front of Nora, her hands on her ample hips. Doyle unfolded a piece of paper. For the recovery of assets related to the outstanding debt of the late Thaddeus Bell, Mr. Crow has filed a claim suggesting that property belonging to the estate is being illegally withheld here. It was a complete fabrication, a legal cudgel designed for one purpose: humiliation. They stormed into the boarding house. It was not a search, it was a violation. They upended laundry baskets, pulled open drawers, ran their grubby hands through Nora's few, neatly folded belongings. Nora stood and watched, her face a pale, still mask, while Ruby silently clung to her skirts. They found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. But the damage was done. Her private space had been invaded, her poverty laid bare for the town to see. Through it all, Nora was aware of a figure standing across the street, watching from the shade of the freight office. It was Wyatt. He stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, a silent observer. He did nothing. He did not cross the street, did not challenge the sheriff, did not offer a single word in her defense. He just watched. To Nora, his stillness was a shout of betrayal. After the intimacy of the mountain pass, the shared terror and the trembling hands, this public distance felt like a repudiation. A cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. He was a businessman, after all. Perhaps he saw her as a liability, a complication in his ongoing war with Crow. Perhaps he was protecting his assets, his freight line, and she was just a small, expendable piece on the board. The thought hurt more than any of Doyle's brutish invasions. That evening, a quiet, miserable tension settled over the ranch. As Nora and Ruby sat by the fire in the main house, Miguel tried to lighten the mood with stories. Wyatt was there too, but he seemed a world away, lost in his own grim thoughts. It was Ruby, in her childlike innocence, who shattered the fragile peace. She looked from Nora's pale face to Wyatt's stern one. "Mr. Wyatt," she asked, her voice small and clear, "are you going to marry Nora?" The effect was instantaneous. Miguel, in the middle of taking a sip of cocoa, choked, spraying a fine mist of brown droplets. Nora's face bloomed with a furious scarlet blush, and Wyatt, the unshakable Wyatt Cade, coughed so hard his entire body shook, his eyes watering as he gasped for air. The moment of pure, unadulterated awkwardness was a small, welcome absurdity in a day filled with calculated cruelty. Later that night, unable to sleep, Nora wandered into the small, dusty office Wyatt used at the ranch. The air was cold and smelled of old paper and leather. Her mind was a turmoil of conflicting emotions, her fierce desire for independence warring with a deep, aching loneliness. She wanted to belong somewhere, but she was terrified that belonging was just another word for being owned. Her eyes fell on a large, sea-worn trunk tucked under an old desk. It was unlocked, driven by a restless, unhappy curiosity. She opened it. It was not filled with ledgers or business papers. It was filled with the remnants of a life, a young woman's life. There was a pressed wildflower, a faded blue ribbon much like her own, and a small, leather-bound diary. Beneath it was a bundle of letters, tied with a black ribbon. The handwriting was feminine, elegant, and full of life. The signature on one was June, with a sense of trespassing that was quickly overcome by a deeper need to understand. Nora began to read. The letters were from Wyatt's younger sister, June, written to a cousin back east. The early ones were full of hope, describing her new husband, their small but growing business, and the raw, beautiful promise of the West. Then the tone began to change. She wrote of a new man in town, a Mr. Crow, who was so helpful at first, offering loans and advice. Then came the whispers of protection fees, of shipments mysteriously delayed, of tools gone missing. June's cheerful script grew tighter, more anxious. She wrote of her husband's growing despair, of the mounting debts that seemed to come from nowhere. The last letter was almost illegible, the ink smudged by what could only have been tears. "He is choking us. Mary," she had written, "Silas Crow is a spider, and we are caught in his web. Wyatt does not see it. He is so practical. He tells us to work harder, to be smarter. But this is not a problem you can solve with hard work. It is a sickness, a poison." Nora put the letters down, her hands trembling. June Cade had not died of a fever, as the town believed. She had died of a broken heart and a broken spirit, crushed under the slow, methodical weight of Silas Crow's greed. Now Nora understood. Wyatt's caution, his calculated distance, was not indifference. It was the deep, agonizing scar of a past failure. He had faced this same enemy before and lost the person he loved most because he had not understood the nature of the fight. He was not avoiding a confrontation with Crow to protect his business. He was preparing for a war he could not afford to lose a second time. Her anger at him melted away, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. She was not a pawn in his game. She was a fellow soldier. The next morning, she knew what she had to do. Running was not an option. Hiding behind Wyatt was not an option. She found her wages, carefully saved and folded, and rode into town. She did not go to the boarding house or the general store. She went to the small adobe building with a neat, hand-painted sign that read, Dr. Amelia Pike. Dr. Pike was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands that were as comfortable setting a bone as they were stitching a wound. She had served as a field surgeon in the Civil War, and there were rumors that she could handle a rifle better than most men in the territory. Nora found her cleaning a set of surgical instruments. She laid her money on the table. "Dr. Pike," Nora said, her voice steady and resolved. "I do not need a physician. I need a teacher." Amelia Pike looked up, her eyebrow arched in question. "I need you to teach me how to shoot," Nora said. "I have decided to stop being the target." The rain began in the late afternoon, a phenomenon so out of season it felt like a curse. It was not the violent, cleansing fury of a summer monsoon, but a cold, persistent drizzle that seeped into everything, turning the red dust of Dry Bone Creek into a thick, clinging mud. The creek itself, true to its name for most of the year, was a sluggish, brown ribbon of water. But the men of the Cade freight line watched the darkening sky with a growing unease. They were in the middle of a critical task constructing a temporary bridge to span a washed-out section of the creek bed, the only way to get their wagons, loaded with the Sunstone Mine's precious medicine, across to the main trail. Work was slow and miserable. The wet ropes were stiff and hard to knot, the timber slick with mud. Wyatt moved among his men, a quiet, reassuring presence, his own coat soaked through, his face grim. Nora worked alongside them, her smaller frame no less determined. She drove support stakes with a sledgehammer, her movements economical and precise, the rhythm of the work a familiar comfort against the growing chill. Ruby, bundled in a thick blanket, watched from the shelter of an overhanging rock, a small, silent observer in a world of mud and toil. The first sign of disaster was not a sight, but a sound. It was a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth, a vibration that grew steadily in intensity until it drowned out the steady drumming of the rain. The men paused, their heads cocked, their faces turning upstream. The rumble became a roar, a hungry, guttural sound that was not thunder. Wyatt was the first to see it. "Up, get to high ground," now he bellowed, his voice a whip crack of pure command. Around the bend in the narrow canyon, a solid wall of churning, brown water was advancing on them. It was not a rising tide, but a battering ram of liquid earth, studded with uprooted trees, rocks, and the debris of a landscape being torn apart. A flash flood, born of the unseasonable rains in the high country, was scouring the canyon clean. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the men. They scrambled for the steep, muddy banks of the creek, abandoning tools, ropes, and the half-finished bridge. The mules, tethered on the far bank, began to scream, their terror a shrill, piercing counterpoint to the flood's deep bass roar. The first wave hit the bridge with the force of a locomotive, and the carefully constructed timber frame vanished in an explosion of splintered wood. The water level rose with terrifying speed, a churning, sucking maelstrom that grabbed at their ankles. In the midst of the chaos, Nora's mind, as it had on the icy pass, found a strange, cold clarity. They were losing everything. The wagons on the far bank, loaded with the life-saving medicine, would be next. Brute force was useless against this, but a plan, born of her laundry woman's logic of working with forces rather than against them, bloomed in her mind. She scrambled up the bank to Wyatt's side. "We cannot stop it," she shouted over the roar. "But we can guide it, the cargo. We have to cut it loose." He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "What are you talking about? That is insane." "No, tie-guide ropes to the crates. Anchor the ropes to the high ground on both sides. And then cut the wagons free, let the water take the weight. And we can pull the crates across like a ferry line once the worst of this has passed. We lose the wagons, but we save the medicine." He looked from her blazing eyes to the roaring torrent, his mind calculating the insane, desperate logistics of her plan. It was a wild gamble, a long shot against impossible odds. But it was better than the alternative, which was standing by and watching everything be destroyed. He saw the unshakable certainty in her face, the same certainty he had seen when she'd predicted the path of the dust storm. He made his decision. "Miguel, you and half the men, with me. We secure the ropes on this side, Nora." He grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "Take the others. Get across that old log jam upstream and handle the east bank. You are in command over there." It was the first time he had ever truly delegated authority, ever relinquished a piece of his absolute control. In the heart of the storm, he was trusting her not just with his cargo, but with the lives of his men. There was no time for a reply. She nodded once, her eyes locking with his for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had just passed between them. She gathered 3 men and plunged back into the swirling, knee-deep water, fighting her way upstream toward the tangle of fallen trees that offered the only path to the other side. The world became a blur of frantic, desperate action. Wyatt and his men worked with the focused energy of a single organism, securing the thickest ropes they had to the base of a massive cottonwood. Across the raging creek, Nora and her team did the same, their smaller numbers compensated for by a desperate, feverish haste. And then, a new, terrible sound cut through the roar of the flood. It was a child's scream. Ruby, terrified by the rising water and the chaos, had left her shelter, trying to get to Nora. She had slipped on the slick, muddy bank, and now she was sliding, tumbling toward the greedy, churning edge of the flood. Time stopped. Nora saw the small patch of color, the bundled blanket, sliding into the brown water. Without a single thought, she turned and launched herself into the torrent. The shock of the cold, powerful water stole her breath. It was a living thing, a muscular, brutal beast that tore at her, trying to drag her under, to pull her into the main current. She fought it, her arms and legs pumping, her eyes fixed on the small, sputtering child who was being swept away. From the bank, Wyatt saw it all. A raw, primal sound of denial was torn from his throat. He grabbed a coil of rope, his hands moving with a speed he did not know he possessed. He knotted one end around his waist, shoved the other into Miguel's hands, and plunged into the flood after her. "Anchor me," he roared. Just as the current was about to carry Ruby into the main channel, Nora reached her. She grabbed a handful of the girl's coat, her fingers locking with a strength she did not know she had. But the victory was momentary. Now the water had them both, their combined weight too much for her to fight. It was pulling them under, down into the cold, muddy darkness. Just as her lungs began to burn, something hit her, a rope snaking through the water. She grabbed it, her hand closing over Wyatt's. He had reached them. His other arm was a band of steel around her waist, pulling her and the child he now held in his other arm back against the relentless, sucking power of the current. Together, with Miguel and the others hauling on the rope from the bank, they fought their way back, inch by agonizing inch, out of the deadly embrace of the flood. They collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping, shivering, a tangled heap of soaked wool and terrified humanity. Ruby was coughing up water but alive, clinging to Nora with a desperate, silent grip. And on the other side of the creek, two men stood and watched. Sheriff Hank Doyle stood frozen, his face pale, his hands limp at his sides, a useless spectator to the life-and-death struggle. Beside him, Silas Crow, who had ridden out to survey the inconvenience to Cade's operations, took a single, deliberate step forward. "Here, let me help," he shouted, his voice a mockery of concern. He lunged toward the nearest wagon, the one containing the carefully inventoried, heavily insured surgical supplies. As the men on that side, distracted by the rescue, turned to look, Silas's hands worked quickly. He shouldered a heavy, sealed crate, and under the cover of the chaos, he heaved it not toward safety, but into the deepest, fastest part of the current, where it was instantly swallowed and swept away. He had the look of a man who had just performed a valuable public service. The flood raged for another hour before it began to recede, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The temporary bridge was gone, the wagons were smashed and ruined, and a significant portion of their precious cargo, including the crate Silas had rescued, was gone, lost to the churning brown water. Cade Freight was teetering on the edge of financial ruin. If they could not deliver the remaining medicine, they were finished. That night, the survivors gathered in the main hall of the Copper Bend Church. Father Whitman, his face stripped of its usual pious platitudes, had thrown the doors open to anyone who needed shelter. Eloise Finch, her face grim but her hands busy, ladled out thick, hot stew to the exhausted, mud-stained men. The formal, judgmental congregation of Sunday was gone, replaced by the true, unspoken community of a town pulling together in the face of disaster. Wyatt stood before the fireplace, his clothes steaming in the heat. He looked at his exhausted crew, at the townspeople who had come to help, and then his eyes found Nora, who sat with a sleeping Ruby in her lap. He raised his voice, and a hush fell over the room. "I want you all to know something," he said, his voice low and raspy, but carrying to every corner of the hall. "We lost a lot today, but we did not lose everything. And the reason we are all here, the reason I am standing here right now—" He paused, and his gaze on Nora was steady and unwavering. "Today, I am alive because of Miss Bell." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, and powerful. It was not a thank you. It was a testimony, a public declaration of a debt that could never be repaid with money. Miles away, in her small, lamp-lit office, Dr. Amelia Pike was not thinking of the flood. She was bent over a document, a magnifying glass in her hand. It was the original deed to Nora's mother's land, which she had acquired through a discreet legal request. Something about the signature had bothered her. Now, under the magnified lens, she saw it. The date of the filing had been altered. A 3 had been cleverly, almost imperceptibly, changed to an 8, invalidating the claim by pushing it past a legal deadline. It was a masterful piece of forgery. She took out a sample of Sheriff Doyle's handwriting from a recent public notice and a bottle of the specific blue-black ink he was known to favor. She dipped a clean pen nib into the ink and drew a line on a scrap of paper next to the altered number on the deed. The color, the texture, the way it feathered at the edges. It was a perfect match. Justice, she thought to herself, was not always found at the end of a gun. Sometimes it was found in a drop of ink. As the first clean light of the post-flood dawn broke over Copper Bend, it illuminated a landscape of mud and ruin. But the sky above was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The storm had washed the world clean, and in doing so, it had washed away all pretense, revealing the true substance of every soul it had touched. The week after the flood was a time of quiet, arduous rebuilding. The collective trauma had scoured away the town's petty grievances, replacing them with a shared sense of purpose. Men who had previously only tipped their hats to each other now worked side by side, clearing debris and shoring up the creek banks. The air, washed clean by the storm, seemed to hold a fragile promise of renewal. But Silas Crow was a man who thrived in the mud, and he had no intention of letting the peace last. He chose his moment with a predator's instinct for public spectacle. It was midday, and the main street, finally dry enough to be a marketplace again, was crowded. Nora was haggling with a farmer over a sack of potatoes, Ruby holding tightly to her hand. When Sheriff Doyle shouldered his way through the crowd, he looked even more uncomfortable than usual, his face slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the midday sun. "Nora Bell," he said, his voice a low mumble that was nonetheless loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The cheerful market chatter died down, replaced by a sudden, avid silence. "Sheriff," Nora replied, her voice cool and steady, though a cold premonition was spreading through her. Doyle held up a piece of paper. It was a freight receipt, smudged and creased. "This here is a bill of lading for a shipment of tools, paid for in cash by the Sunstone mine foreman. The payment was given to you last week, before the flood, but the money was never logged in the Cade freight ledgers." Nora stared at him, her mind racing. "That is ridiculous. I never saw that receipt. I never took any such payment." "Well, Mr. Crow found the receipt near the washout." Doyle continued, his voice gaining a false note of confidence as he played his rehearsed part. "He was just trying to help, cleaning up the mess. Says he saw the whole transaction, a cash payment, which is now missing." He cleared his throat. "Nora Bell, I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of embezzlement." The word, ugly and final, hung in the silent air. It was a perfect trap. Her word against Silas Crow's, the evidence, a piece of paper he had likely forged himself. Ruby began to cry, a small, frightened sound. The faces of the townspeople, so recently united in common cause, were now a shifting sea of suspicion and morbid curiosity. Doyle reached for her arm. "You need to come with me." "No," Nora said, her voice shaking with a cold, righteous fury. She pulled her arm back. "This is a lie." But Doyle's hand was already closing around her wrist when another voice, cold and sharp as splintered ice, cut through the scene. "That will be all. Sheriff." Wyatt Cade stepped into the circle of onlookers. He had not been in the market, but word of the commotion had traveled with the speed of a prairie fire. He was not wearing a gun belt, but he radiated an authority more potent than any weapon. He walked directly to Nora's side, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. "This is official business." "Cade," Doyle blustered, though his grip on Nora's arm loosened. "This is a farce," Wyatt countered, his voice low and dangerous. "What is the bail?" Doyle blinked, thrown off balance. "Bail has not been set. She has to be processed." "Set it now," Wyatt commanded, "or I will ride to the county seat and bring back a circuit judge who will ask you some very pointed questions about your relationship with Silas Crow." The threat, delivered without a hint of emotion, was devastatingly effective. Doyle's face went pale. He knew, as did everyone, that his brand of local, malleable justice would not stand up to outside scrutiny. $1,000, he mumbled, naming a figure so outrageously high he clearly thought it was impossible. Wyatt did not even flinch. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them until it landed on the proprietor of the general store. "Mr. Henderson, I am posting my land deed for the North Quarter section as bond for Miss Bell. I will have the papers brought to you within the hour. You will hold them in your safe until this is resolved. My credit is good, is it not?" Henderson, a man who respected assets above all else, nodded quickly. "Yes, Mr. Cade, your credit is excellent." Wyatt turned back to Doyle, his eyes like chips of granite. "She is released into my custody, and I'm filing a countersuit against Silas Crow for malicious prosecution and defamation. You will find that my lawyers are considerably more expensive than yours. Now take your hands off her." Doyle dropped Nora's arm as if it were a hot coal. He stammered something, then turned and practically fled through the crowd, which parted for him in a wave of stunned silence. Wyatt stood beside Nora, a silent, immovable bastion. He did not look at her, but she could feel the rigid control in his posture, the tightly leashed fury. He had not just defended her, he had drawn a line of battle in the middle of the town square for all to see. He had publicly, and financially, chosen his side. Back at the ranch, the silence was of a different kind. It was heavy with unspoken words, with the raw, jangled aftermath of public humiliation and unexpected rescue. Nora sat at the large oak table in the main house, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she was not drinking. Ruby, finally calm, was asleep on a nearby cot. Wyatt stood by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. The air between them was thick with tension. Nora's gratitude was a fragile, trembling thing, tangled up with a deep, unsettling uncertainty. She finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" He turned from the window, his face shadowed and unreadable. He was wrong. It was more than that. She pressed, needing to understand, needing to unravel the knot of obligation and emotion that was tightening in her chest. She stood up and faced him. "You put up a piece of your ranch. You declared war on him. Was it to protect your business, Your Honor?" She took a breath, and the real question, the one that terrified her, finally came out. "Or were you protecting me because you think of me as one of your possessions?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and dangerous as a shard of broken glass. His face hardened, and for a moment she thought she had made a terrible mistake, that she had insulted the very core of his pride. But when he spoke, his voice was raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I did it," he said, taking a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Because you are you, because you are Nora Bell, not because you work for me, and not because you are a woman who needs protecting." He stopped, searching for the right words, the muscles in his jaw tight. "I have seen what power like his does to people. I have seen what my own power can do. The last thing on this earth I ever want is for my strength to feel like a cage to you. I did it because your dignity is your own, and he had no right to touch it." The simple, profound honesty of his words disarmed her completely. It was the answer she had not even known she was desperate to hear. It was not a declaration of love, but something far more valuable, a declaration of respect. The evening grew cold. He saw her shiver, a slight tremor she tried to hide. He turned and took a heavy wool coat from a peg by the door. He walked back to her and held it out, but he did not try to place it over her shoulders. He did not touch her at all. He simply offered it, his gaze holding hers, a silent communication that was more intimate than any physical contact. The space between them was charged, a place of respect that was slowly, tentatively, making room for passion. She took the coat, her fingers brushing his, and wrapped it around herself. The wool was warm and smelled faintly of him, of leather and clean, cold air. The next few days were a quiet storm of activity, while Nora and Wyatt maintained a careful, watchful peace at the ranch. Miguel and Dr. Amelia Pike went on the offensive. They rode out to the isolated shack where Mason, the gunsmith, lived in a state of self-imposed, alcoholic exile. It took 2 hours, a bottle of good whiskey, and Amelia's direct, no-nonsense appeal to the soldier he had once been. But Mason finally broke. He confessed, his voice a rusty whisper, to marking the bullets. He even produced a hidden ledger, and in it, an entry detailing a pest control contract with Silas Crow, the terms of which were unmistakably a long-standing protection racket. Amelia, meanwhile, turned her sharp, analytical mind to the town's ledgers, which Doyle, under the pressure of Wyatt's legal threats, had been forced to make available in the records of deeds and titles. She found exactly what she was looking for, a page where an entry had been clumsily erased, leaving behind a faint scarring on the paper. The date of the erasure corresponded to the week after Nora's uncle had died. It was the proof of the original. Valid title, deliberately destroyed. At the ranch, Eloise Finch came to visit, bringing a basket of food and her own brand of earthy wisdom. She found Wyatt and Nora in the kitchen, a rare moment of quiet domesticity as Nora showed Ruby how to knead bread dough. "Well," Eloise said, setting her basket down with a decisive thump, "you two look about as comfortable as two cats in a sack." She eyed them both, her gaze missing nothing of the charged atmosphere between them. "Love is not a stew. You know," she declared to the room at large. "You cannot just put a lid on it and let it simmer forever. Eventually, it boils over." Ruby, her hands and face covered in flour, looked up with wide, serious eyes. "If it boils over," she said with perfect, simple logic, "you eat it with the bread." Eloise let out a hoot of delighted laughter, and the tension in the room finally broke. Nora knew that a turning point had been reached. She was beginning to trust him, to believe that his protection was not a form of ownership. But the fight was not over, and the final decision, the one that would define her future, still had to be her own. They began to prepare. They were no longer just defending. They were building a case. Wyatt sent riders to the men who had worked for his sister and her husband, men who had been squeezed out by Crow and had scattered across the territory. He sent a message to the blacksmith who had forged the unique horseshoes for Crow's stallion, offering him protection and a new start in exchange for his testimony. They spoke to Father Whitman, showing him the proof of Crow's long history of predatory lending. The gentle priest's face hardened with a quiet, steely resolve. The town was no longer a passive audience to a drama between powerful men. It was becoming a jury. People who had been afraid to speak, who had kept their heads down for years, began to step forward with their own stories, their own small pieces of evidence. The fight was no longer just Nora's, or even Wyatt's. It was becoming Copper Bend's. They were preparing for a reckoning. The sun was a judge in a brassy sky, holding court over Copper Bend. There was no formal courtroom, no robed official from the county seat. The trial, such as it was, convened on the wide, warped planks of the town hall porch. The entire community stood as jury, their silent, sun-scorched faces forming a tight, expectant circle in the dust of the main street. This was frontier justice, raw and immediate, a public weighing of souls. Silas Crow stood near the town hall door, impeccably dressed in his funereal black, a look of somber civic duty carefully arranged on his pale face. Beside him, Sheriff Hank Doyle shifted his weight from foot to foot, the silver star on his sweat-stained vest seeming to weigh him down, its polished surface reflecting the anxious faces of the crowd. They were the prosecution, the twin pillars of a corrupt and crumbling authority. Opposite them stood Nora, with Wyatt at her side. She wore a simple, clean dress, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, she was not wearing her patched straw hat. Her face was open to the harsh light, her expression calm, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She was not the accused. She was the accuser. Wyatt stood a respectful foot away from her, a silent, unshakable presence. He was not her champion, but her witness. Dr. Amelia Pike stood nearby, a leather portfolio of papers held firmly in one hand. Doyle, prodded by a sharp look from Crow, cleared his throat and officially began the proceedings. He read the charge of embezzlement in a dull monotone, his words a flimsy legal pretext for the public spectacle Crow had engineered. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell. All eyes turned to Nora. She did not address Doyle or Crow. She spoke to the ring of faces, to the people of Copper Bend. "Most of you know me," she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the still air. "You know I do your laundry, serve your meals. You know I work hard for my wages." She paused, her gaze sweeping over them. "Mr. Crow and Sheriff Doyle would have you believe that I am a thief, that I would steal money from the very business that gave me honest work. They have a piece of paper they say is proof." She took a step forward. "I would like to offer a different kind of proof. I want to tell you about what happened 3 weeks ago, up on Blacktooth Pass." A murmur went through the crowd. They had all heard the story, in bits and pieces, but now they leaned in, hungry for the truth from its source. She told them everything, her voice simple and direct, devoid of drama or self-pity. She described the unnatural cold, the glint of ice on the narrow track, the terrible, final snap of the shearing pin. She described the weight of the wagon, the terror of the mules, the feeling of the world sliding out from under them toward the abyss. "In that moment," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "I did not think about money. I did not think about myself. I thought about the medicine in that wagon and the men on that mountain. I saw a problem, and I saw a solution." She held up her right hand, showing them the pale, new skin of the scar on her palm. "I took a chalk block and a length of rope. I went under the wagon tongue, and I jammed that wedge against the wheel. I did it to create a drag, to give Mr. Cade and the others a chance to regain control. I did it to save the cargo, and to save our lives." She looked directly at the faces in the crowd. "At the wives and mothers, the farmers and the blacksmith? I ask you, is that the action of a woman who would steal from her employer, or is that the action of someone who honors her work and the people she works beside?" The silence that answered her was more powerful than any cheer. She had not argued the law. She had argued her character. Now it was Amelia Pike's turn. She stepped forward, opening her portfolio. "Character is one thing," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "Facts are another. Let us examine the facts." One by one, she dismantled Silas Crow's world. She called Mason, the gunsmith, forward, the old soldier, sober for the first time in years, stood hunched and miserable. But his voice was firm as he identified the marked bullet recovered from the Drybone Creek ambush and read the entry from his private ledger detailing his pest control contract with Crow. Next came the blacksmith. He testified that the distinctive crescent-shaped horseshoes found in the snow on Blacktooth Pass could only have come from the private stock he forged exclusively for Silas Crow's stallion. Then, Amelia produced the magnified image of the erased entry in the town deed book and the forged date on Nora's mother's title. She held it up next to a public notice written in Sheriff Doyle's own hand. The forgery, the specific ink, the clumsy attempt to hide the truth, it was all laid bare for the town to see. Doyle began to stammer, his face turning a blotchy, terrified red. He looked to Crow for help, but Crow was no longer smiling. His face was a mask of cold, reptilian fury. He took a menacing step toward Mason. "You old fool," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous threat. "You will regret this for the rest of your short life." He had overplayed his hand. The public threat, the naked intimidation, was a confession in itself. He had shot himself with his own poison arrow. A space cleared in the crowd, and Father Whitman stepped onto the porch. He was not holding a Bible. He held a single sheet of paper. He represented the conscience of the town, and his face was filled with a sad, righteous anger. "This is not a court of law," he said, his voice resonating with a new, unfamiliar authority. "But it is a court of community, and we, the community of Copper Bend, find Silas Crow guilty of coercion, guilty of fraud, and guilty of the crime of economic violence against his neighbors." He looked directly at Crow. "We declare your contracts and your debts to be null and void. You are no longer a banker in this town. You are a pariah." Then he turned to the trembling sheriff. "And you, Hank Doyle, you have betrayed your oath and your star. You are no longer our lawman." Father Whitman reached out and, with 2 steady fingers, he unpinned the silver star from Doyle's vest and let it drop to the dusty porch with a soft, final clink. It was over. Doyle, stripped of his authority, seemed to shrink into himself. Crow stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and impotent rage. The crowd did not cheer or jeer. They simply began to disperse, melting back into the life of the town, leaving the 2 disgraced men alone in their public ruin. In the center of the now empty square, Nora stood alone. The wind picked up, swirling the red dust around her ankles. She was free. The land was hers. The threat was gone, but the victory felt heavy, and she was so incredibly tired. Wyatt walked toward her, his boots slow and measured on the dusty ground. He stopped in front of her. He did not reach for her, did not try to embrace her. He simply took off his hat, a gesture of profound respect, and held it in his hands. Then he reached out and gently took her right hand, the one with the new, pale scar. He lifted it, turned it over, and in front of God and the last lingering eyes of Copper Bend, he pressed his lips to the back of her calloused hand. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence, a pledge. He looked up, and his eyes, the color of a storm-cleared sky, held hers. "I do not want to redeem you from anyone, Nora," he said, his voice low and impossibly gentle. "I want to be chosen by you, here, in front of this town you have just reclaimed. I am asking you to be my wife, if you will have me. And if you will not," he added, his voice thick with emotion, "I will still stand here, with you, to protect this land and your right to it, for as long as I live." From the porch of the boarding house, a clear, delighted voice rang out. It was Eloise Finch, holding up a freshly printed handbill from the town's small press, a souvenir she had prepared in hopeful anticipation. She read the headline aloud, her voice filled with laughter and tears. "Virgin stopped his runaway wagon. Rich cowboy kissed her hand. Proposed chose her forever." A wave of warm, cathartic laughter rolled through the remaining onlookers. The ridiculous, romantic, and ultimately true headline had captured the legend of the day. Nora looked at Wyatt, at his honest, open face, at the heart he was offering her not as a price or a prize, but as a partnership. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unburdened joy. "I choose freedom," she said, her voice clear and strong, "and I choose you within that freedom." The townspeople did not shout or throw their hats in the air. This was the West, and their joy was a deeper, quieter thing. They simply nodded, a slow, collective gesture of approval, of witnessing a thing that was right and true. Wyatt did not put his hat back on. He placed it on the porch railing beside them, setting it down so that its brim was level with her eyes. They were equals. He was not her rescuer, and she was not his ward. He had offered her a choice, and she had made it. Forever. The exodus of Silas Crow was not a dramatic, storm-filled departure. It was a quiet, methodical dismantling. The power he had wielded for years, a thing of whispers and implied threats, evaporated under the harsh, direct sun of public condemnation. The town, acting as a single entity, enacted its own form of justice, a portion of his assets. Those directly tied to fraudulent loans and foreclosures were seized and placed under the stewardship of a committee led by Dr. Amelia Pike to be redistributed or used for the public good. He was not run out of town on a rail. He was simply erased. He packed his black broadcloth suits into a single trunk, his movements stiff with a rage that had no outlet. As his buggy rolled down the main street for the last time, no one jeered or threw stones. They simply watched, their faces impassive, their silence a far more profound and damning judgment than any shout could have been. He was a ghost, and they had chosen to stop seeing him. Hank Doyle's exit was even less dignified. stripped of his star. He was just a large, lost man with no one left to give him orders. He left on foot, his belongings in a shabby carpet bag, avoiding the eyes of the people he had once held authority over. In his wake, a different kind of change took root. Mason, the gunsmith, was offered sanctuary and honest work at the town forge. The blacksmith, a man of few words, simply pointed to a spare anvil and a pile of iron, an invitation to build rather than destroy, under the steadying rhythm of the forge hammer. Mason began to sweat out years of bitter regret. His hands, once used to crafting tools of intimidation, now learning to shape horseshoes and plowshares. With the shadow of Crow lifted, a current of clean, productive energy flowed through the region. The remaining medicine was loaded onto fresh wagons and, with the late autumn weather holding clear and crisp, the Cade freight line made the journey up through Blacktooth Pass. The arrival at the Sunstone mining camp was met with a wave of profound, exhausted relief. Wyatt Cade's honor was not just restored, it was solidified, forged in iron and ice. The pass, once a symbol of danger and sabotage, was now officially open, a new artery of commerce that promised a prosperity built on courage and sweat, not fear and debt. The wedding was as simple and solid as a newly sunk fence post. There were no invitations, no elaborate dress, no crowd of formal well-wishers. It took place on a Tuesday afternoon on the wide north porch of the Cade ranch house, the same porch Wyatt had once offered as a place of refuge. Father Whitman officiated, his words stripped of their usual Sunday ceremony, speaking instead of partnership, of the shared yoke and the common road. Eloise Finch, her face beaming, had not baked a delicate, sugar-spun cake, but a massive loaf of sourdough bread. Its crust so deeply brown and fragrant, it seemed to contain all the warmth and sustenance of a true home. Their witnesses were their chosen family. Miguel stood beside Wyatt, his usual grin softened by a deep, quiet pride. When the moment came for a toast, he raised not a glass of whiskey, but a tall, cool glass of milk, a tribute to the simple, life-giving goodness he saw in the union. And Ruby, her shyness momentarily forgotten in the gravity of her role, stood before Nora. She did not throw rice or flower petals. Instead, she held up the small, faded blue ribbon Nora had carried for so long, the last tangible piece of her mother. With a solemn reverence, she presented it to Nora, who tied it around the small bouquet of hardy wildflowers she held in her hand. It was a joining of the past and the future, a promise that memory would be a foundation, not an anchor. They said their vows as the afternoon sun slanted across the porch, their promises as plain and durable as the wood beneath their feet. Life did not so much change as it settled into a new, truer rhythm. Nora did not become the idle rancher's wife, overseeing a staff of servants. She became the working partner she had always been, the ranch office. Once solely Wyatt's domain of ledgers and maps, now had a second chair at the desk. Her sharp mind for detail and her practical, no-nonsense approach to problems were as valuable as any team of mules. She still mended canvas and spliced rope, not because she had to, but because she was good at it, and because the work itself was a part of who she was. She found a deep satisfaction in the physical logic of a well-tied knot, the integrity of a solid repair. Wyatt, in turn, began to learn the unfamiliar language of a shared domestic life. He, a man who could command a dozen rough men and a team of 8 stubborn mules, was utterly baffled by the simple mechanics of hanging laundry. He would stand on the north porch, a basket of wet clothes at his feet, his brow furrowed in concentration, and invariably hang the shirts upside down, or pin a sheet so it dragged in the dust. Nora would watch him from the kitchen window, a fond, exasperated smile on her face, before coming out to gently correct him. He was a surprisingly humble student. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he tried out a new word, testing its weight. "Wife," he said, the sound soft and a little awkward in the quiet room. "Could you pass me that book?" Nora looked at him over the edge of her own book. a playful, challenging light in her eyes. She wrinkled her nose. "My name is Nora," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "I am not a teacup you have acquired for the shelf. You fell in love with Nora. I would appreciate it if you would continue to speak to her." He looked taken aback for a moment, and then a slow, understanding grin spread across his face. He had spent his life owning things land, a business, livestock. He was learning, day by day, that you do not own a person, you simply get to walk beside them. "Nora," he said, his voice rich with affection, "would you please pass me the book?" The healing that took place at the ranch radiated outward, back into the heart of Copper Bend. The public trial had been a catharsis, and in its aftermath, the town began to redefine itself. Justice was no longer a star on a fat man's chest. It became a daily practice. The women of the town, who had once whispered about Nora behind her back, began to show up at the ranch in small, curious groups. They came, ostensibly, to learn her famously efficient way of mending canvas, or the trick to her diamond hitch knot. But really, they came to be near her quiet strength, to learn the subtle art of self-reliance. The men, likewise, began to gather in the evenings at Dr. Amelia Pike's office. She held informal talks, explaining the complexities of land laws, water rights, and incorporation. She taught them that the law was not just a weapon to be used against them, but a tool they could wield themselves. Knowledge, she showed them, was a form of power that, unlike crows, could be shared without being diminished. The change was made visible in the very center of town. A group of men, Wyatt and Miguel among them, organized a work party to clean out the public well. For years, its water had been murky, tainted by runoff and neglect. They spent a whole day hauling up buckets of silt and debris, reinforcing the stone walls. Until finally, the water that bubbled up from the deep spring was clean and sweet and ran perfectly clear. That Sunday, when the church bell rang, the sound itself seemed different. It was not the tolling, commanding summons of old, demanding attendance. It was a lighter, more joyful peal, an invitation, not an order. The people who gathered inside were not there out of habit or fear of judgment, but out of a newfound sense of genuine community. In the quiet moments, in the spaces between the work and the life they were building, Nora and Wyatt were learning the most difficult and important lesson of all. They were learning to love without consuming one another. He learned to respect her need for solitude, the quiet core of her that would always be her own. She learned to accept his protection not as a cage, but as the shelter of a great, steady tree that she was free to leave at any time. They were two strong, independent people who had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in merging into one, but in standing side by side, each of them whole, their lives intertwined but not entangled, respecting each other's breathing room. The end of the day settled over Copper Bend like a benediction. From the crest of a low hill overlooking the town, the setting sun performed its final, silent alchemy, transforming the very air into liquid gold. The red dust, for so long a symbol of hardship and oppression, now hung suspended in the light, each particle a glittering ember, as if the earth itself were breathing out a soft, contented sigh. Below, the town was a miniature of wood and stone, the lights beginning to glow in the windows like scattered stars. The sound of the Cade freight mules, heading back to the ranch for the night, was a steady, rhythmic beat, the clink of their harnesses a kind of plain song. They were all there, gathered on a wide, flat rock that was still warm from the day's heat. It was not a formal celebration, but a quiet, shared moment of peace. Wyatt and Nora sat side by side, not touching, but connected by an invisible current of ease and understanding. Ruby was nestled between them, her head leaning against Nora's arm, a small slate and a piece of chalk in her lap. A little ways off, Miguel was showing Father Whitman how to whittle a piece of cottonwood, their heads bent together in concentration. Eloise Finch and Dr. Amelia Pike sat together, sharing a thermos of coffee, their conversation a low, comfortable murmur. This was their family, a peculiar and wonderful constellation of souls bound not by the rigid ties of blood, but by the stronger, more flexible threads of loyalty, respect, and shared struggle. They had built this peace together, out of the wreckage of the old order. They were a living testament to the idea that a community was not a thing you were born into, but a thing you chose to create, day by day, here on this quiet hillside. The themes of their lives had come full circle. Dignity was not a thing to be granted by the powerful, but a thing you carried inside you, as fundamental as your own bones. Justice was not a distant abstraction, but the daily, sometimes difficult, practice of seeing your neighbors clearly and treating them with fairness. And freedom, the most precious and hard-won prize of all, was the right to choose your own path and the courage to walk it. They were living alongside one another, not under the thumb of any single authority. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of purple and rose, Wyatt turned to Nora. The boisterous energy of their shared victory had softened, over the weeks, into a deep, quiet gratitude that lived in the space between them. He looked out at the lights of the town she had saved as surely as she had saved him. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely disturbing the quiet air. "The day you jammed that wedge under the wheel on the pass, you saved more than just the freight." He paused, then turned his gaze to her, his eyes full of a raw, honest light she had come to know as the truest part of him. "You saved my heart." Nora looked down at her hands, clasped in her lap. She thought of the man he had been, walled off by grief and discipline, and the man he was now, his strength tempered by a newfound gentleness. She thought of his shocking public proposal, an act of faith that had shattered the town's expectations. "And you," she answered, her voice soft but sure, "when you kissed my hand in front of the whole world, you did more than ask me a question." She met his eyes, a small, sure smile on her lips. "You gave me back the right to say yes." He reached for her hand then, and their fingers intertwined. A simple, perfect fit. He brought her hand not to his lips, but rested it on his knee, a gesture of quiet, contented possession that was not about ownership at all. A few days earlier, he had come to her in the barn, where she was inspecting a newly repaired harness. He was holding his old leather work gloves. They were worn and scarred, shaped by years of hard labor, symbols of the control and responsibility that had once defined his solitary life. He had held them out to her. "I want you to have these," he had said. She had looked at him, confused. "They would not fit me." "It is not for you to wear them," he had explained, his expression serious. "They are the key to the stables, the key to the whole ranch. Really, they mean you have as much right to be here, to command, to decide, as I do. They are not a gift. They are your share." She had taken them, the worn leather still holding the warmth of his hands. Later, she had found her own symbol. Miguel, at her request, had helped her forge a small hammer, perfectly balanced for her hand, for the fine work of mending and repairs, and on the smooth, fire-hardened hickory handle. She had carefully, if a little unevenly, carved her own name, Nora. It was not Nora Cade. It was Nora, whole and complete. As the first true stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ruby, who had been scribbling intently on her slate, held it up for them to see. She had not been practicing her letters. She had been teaching. In the center of the slate, in a child's earnest, wobbly script, she had written a single sentence. It said, "Freedom is knowing how to choose and keeping the choice you make." Wyatt read the words, and a slow, wondering smile spread across his face. He looked at Nora, his eyes full of a quiet awe, out of the mouth of a babe who had lost everything. Here was the lesson they had all learned. No one was a debt to be paid. Love in this hard, beautiful country was not about conquest, about taking or claiming. It was about choosing to shoulder the same load, to walk the same trail, to face the same storms, together. And justice was not a single, dramatic showdown. It was the patient accumulation of evidence, the courage of a single voice telling the truth, and the strength of a community that finally decides to listen. The evening bell from Father Whitman's church began to ring, its clear, gentle notes floating up the hill, calling the town to rest. It was time to go down. Wyatt stood up and helped Nora to her feet. He held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. "Tomorrow we take the new shipment over the pass," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "Do not forget the linchpins." He laughed, a warm, easy sound that held no echo of his former stiffness. "Now that I have a wife," he said, pulling her close, "I find I do not forget things nearly as often." They gathered their small, remarkable family and began to walk down the hill, their silhouettes dark against the star-dusted sky. They moved as one, not toward an ending, but toward the steady, shared and chosen rhythm of the rest of their lives. Thank you for joining us for this story here on Wild West Night. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.